Welcome to the 2024 AWP Conference and Book Fair in Kansas City, Missouri. Thanks for joining us. It's nice to see you all. I'm Sean Bernard. I'm the Western Region Chair and member of the Board of Directors for AWP. Just so you know, I'm here from California. I'm wearing blue jeans, a blue shirt, an AWP shirt, glasses. I'm a writer. So that's how I look today. AWP's mission is to support and amplify the voices of writers and the writing programs that support them. And we do this while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. I serve on AWP's board, but I'm also a member, and I hope you'll consider joining me as one. Being a member of AWP provides me writing resources throughout the year, not just the conference, which is amazing, and it helps me support writers at the start of their careers. I hope many of you are those. Two of the great programs AWP features are the Writer-to-Writer Mentorship Program. Applications go live over the summer, and the HBCU Fellowship Program that began last year. Our literary partners allow us to present these great events that you'll see today and all week, and I hope you're appreciative of, as am I, of their support. Particularly the sponsor of today's event, the National Book Foundation. Before we get started, I'm almost done. Some quick housekeeping. Please silence your phones. Please no flash photography. After the presentation, please allow the panelists time and space to get to the book signing table that's across the hall. And last, we also ask that you be aware of your fellow attendees who may have disabilities, visible or otherwise. To help AWP out, if you see a barrier to accessibility at any time during the conference, please quickly notify a staff member or text our hotline. I'm going to say numbers to you. You can write them down. I'll be slow. 240-269-6635. Thank you. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Natalie Green, the Director of Programs and Partnerships for the National Book Foundation, to introduce our event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm Ruth Dickey. I'm the Executive Director of the National Book Foundation. I'm subbing for Natalie to introduce our event today. I'm wearing a white shirt and a mustard-colored scarf, and I have on very large earrings and my hair up in a bun. Thank you so much, Sean, for that welcome. Thank you to Jake Sparks and Samantha Surna for their ASL interpretation today. Thanks to Jeanette Christian for live captioning, and for all of the folks who are working so very hard behind the scenes to make the 2024 AWP conference possible. And thanks to all of you here in this room and everyone live streaming at home for joining us. In this especially difficult and painful moment, it feels like no small thing to be gathered together with so many writers, readers, literary organizations, publications, and partners in conversation about books and the power of stories to connect us and help us imagine futures that look different from our current moment. Thank you for being with us. At the National Book Foundation, we work year-round to bring National Book Award honored authors to readers across the country through book distributions and events, as well as online series like Read with NBF, a monthly read-along with me of our 2023 National Book Award winners, which features exclusive author interviews, book chats with NBF staff, and special surprises. And if that's not enough, this fall we'll celebrate the 75th National Book Awards. We'd love for you to join us in some bookish fun. Keep an eye for our anniversary website launch later next month at nationalbook.org and subscribe to our e-newsletter at the back of the room to stay in the loop. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to be in conversation with two brilliant National Book Award honorees, Susan Choi and Sarah Thankam Mathews, on writing and reading coming-of-age stories and so much more. You'll get to hear Susan and Sarah read, and then we'll have a conversation. Immediately after the event, outside the ballroom, the authors' books are available for purchase with thanks to our partners at Rainy Day Books, and Sarah and Susan will join us for a signing following the program. And now I'm delighted to introduce our authors. Susan Choi is the author of 5 novels, including Trust Exercise, which won the 2019 National Book Award for Fiction. She has also been the recipient of the Asian American Literary Award for Fiction, the Penn W.G. Sebald Award, a Lambda Literary Award, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. She teaches in the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins. Sarah Thankam Mathews is the author of All This Could Be Different, which was a finalist for the 2022 National Book Award in Fiction. It was also a New York Times Editor's Choice and named Best Book of the Year by NPR, Vogue, Vulture, the Los Angeles Times, Time, Slate, and BuzzFeed. Mathews grew up between Oman and India, immigrating to the United States at 17. Please join me in welcoming them both, and Susan's gonna read for us first. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Great. I'm going to read actually an excerpt from something that I'm working on currently. I think it also qualifies as a coming-of-age story in certain ways, so theme will be upheld. This is an excerpt from a short story called Flashlight, and all you really need to know is that Louisa is a 10-year-old girl who has been sent to talk to a child psychiatrist. She was startled to find Dr. Brickner just over one shoulder. She turned away from the dollhouse, stepping neatly around him, and dropped into a chair. Moments before, during the introductions, the thing to do had been to shirk his eye contact and look at the things in the room that weren't him. Now he'd caught her looking interested in something, and the thing to do was shirk that something and seem not to care about it. They were alone together, and no one had told her how long it would last, but let it last forever. She wouldn't give him anything. "You can play with the dollhouse," he said, and she was pleased to hear a tinge of supplication. "That's what it's there for." "That's okay." "Would you like to draw? I have terrific drawing stuff." "That's okay. I don't really enjoy drawing." Right away, she regretted this offering. Sure enough, he nimbly caught on. Perhaps he was actually listening. "What kinds of things do you enjoy?" Certain adults could do this, Louisa had noticed. Instead of oohing or saying, "You sound so grown up when you talk," these adults deftly plucked your words from the air and then flicked them back at you with a straight face, as if they thought you might somehow become hypnotized. It was a game, and not a playful type of game, but a competitive, score-keeping game. The quick-witted adult snatching one bit of you after another. "What's that flashlight for?" Louisa asked him, and now his mind had to spring to flashlight and pretend that the question was what he'd expected. The flashlight stood on the windowsill, bulb end pointing down. The windows in the room were very large and high with deep sills, and the deep sills were very cluttered, as every surface in the room was cluttered. There were potted plants set close together, and in the space between them, ugly artworks made from balls and tubes of clay incompetently stuck together, and other knick-knacky arts and crafts garbage that Louisa supposed other children made during their appointments. Amid all this, the flashlight hardly stood out, and Dr. Brickner had to crane his neck around in awkward, almost panic, to figure out what she was talking about. "It's to see in the dark," he said, clownishly. "You have lights." He abandoned the clowning. "It's in case of a power outage, which doesn't happen often, but it could happen, especially if there's an earthquake. Where I lived before I moved here, there were earthquakes all the time. In Japan." She was disappointed somehow that he already knew this, but of course, he already knew everything. "Can we turn out the lights? It won't be dark. You could pull the blinds down." "It still won't be dark. It will be dim," Dr. Brickner predicted, but he was already doing it. The blinds were an ancient, unreliable mess and were clearly never closed. As Dr. Brickner struggled with them, they fought back, their long metal strips rattling and seesawing slantwise and releasing a dust plume before they seemed to surrender and fall all at once. The dust, dissipating, glinted erratically as if flashing a code as it crossed the slim rays of afternoon light that were streaming in through the gap where the blinds didn't quite meet the wall. When her eyes adjusted, Louisa could see everything, but it was pleasantly dusky, so long as she didn't look straight at the needles of sun. Dr. Brickner, reaching over his desk toward the chair where she sat, held the flashlight out to her. It was surprisingly, satisfyingly heavy. Louisa slid the plastic switch with her thumb, and a pale cloud of light appeared on the ceiling. "Oh, good," he said. "I thought the batteries might have gone dead." "If they had, and this was an earthquake, you'd be in trouble." Very true. She played the light over the ceiling, almost forgetting about him. The ceiling was far above her, twice as far as the extinguished overhead light, which was the hideous kind that looks like a huge upside-down ice tray. Beyond the enormous ice tray, the faint pool of light ventured over the ceiling and slid down the wall. It seemed alive, a being both at her command and mysterious to her. "Do, do, 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 do," she sang out, now inexplicably goofy. She was singing those 5 famous notes that everyone recognized lately, the UFO greeting from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Dr. Brickner laughed. They gazed up at the ceiling as if something were actually there. "Did you like that movie?" asked his voice, which she found more tolerable than when she had to look in his face. "It scared me." Her honesty surprised and annoyed her. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I want to thank AWP, the National Book Foundation, and really the entire constellation of people whose hard work and planning makes events like this possible at all. I'm going to read from the 3rd chapter of my novel, All This Could Be Different. C1. In college, I had not known how to get women, not in person. In secret, I'd posted on Craigslist in the sleepless reaches of the night, replied to a personal ad or 2. These assignations had given me a degree of confidence, were a bulwark against the terror of total inexperience. Now, I had moved to a new city and wanted the real thing. Some damp July night, I walked an hour to a bar I had heard was right. I was wearing the makeup from work and a filmy blouse. It showed my body's clean lines. My hair fell to my collarbone. It all gave the wrong idea. Dykes in hiking boots and windbreakers took one look at me, and the few that did not prefer white girls in that wordless, unexamined way made a beeline. No, 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 I wanted to say, not you. We could be friends, move together in a pack. I shrugged off the tall butch in her brown vest who was bearing down on me, thumbing the curve of my waist. As bad as any man. I crossed towards the girl who just walked in. A white little face set against dark hair, a Pulp Fiction bob, an uncertainty in her eyes that made her soft. She was at the bar, drinking wine out of a doubles glass. I looked down at her red, bitten mouth and felt my clit jump. I smiled, a wolf smile with my eyes. In the past, I had tried to be suave, elaborate, and things had gone a mediocre route. This time, I simply said, "Hello." When she laughed, leaned close to me, I looked for the aging woman in the brown vest. Our eyes met, and she looked so sour. In her mind, Pulp Fiction and I both should have been hers. My lips twitched. Washed up, old dyke. I knew how beautiful I was in that moment. Felt it burned into me, a brand. This is how I felt, alone and powerful. This is what I felt. The shock of how your life's longing can sometimes be smoothly realized, without great strain or cost, easy as buying a clock. In undergrad, I had been required to study a near unreadable German novel about a young man who runs away from home to escape the pressure of his family's desires for him. For years, he roams around, joins a theater troupe, gathers the friends that become the extension of his family, but by the end, he chooses his destiny, chooses the staid, sensible life that his parents want, finds a wife, all of his own free will. That's what a true adulthood had come to signify for me, a bowing down before the inevitable. For the lucky, this could be preceded by a period of freedom, the latitude of youth. That's what I have right now, I thought, tracing the outline of my debit card, leaning my elbows against the cold, dark acetate of the bar. As we crossed the bar windows, when I was sure Brown Vest would be looking, I gathered Pulp Fiction to me, kissed her. This is what I remember, even now, Pulp Fiction, who meant nothing to me. There was a safety in this nothing, a gate around me, black glossy hair, a vacant smile, her lips softly parting for mine, her tender little throat exposed. Streetlights turned the night the dark orange of a bee's thorax. Slow, delicious, violence rose in me. I gathered the crown of her dark bob tight in my fist. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for those beautiful readings, and I love your books, and I'm so excited for this conversation. And I'd love to start with today's conversation is grounded in this question of coming-of-age stories, and both of you are wrestling with characters who do come of age over the course of the books. And I wonder, why is that particular slice of life interesting to you as writers? And
I was just talking to a colleague and friend up in the book fair about teenagers, and I think that the reason that I'm so interested in teenagers isn't just because I have two of them in my home. When I was writing this book, which is about teenagers, in large part I actually didn't yet have teenagers, but there's something really crucial, I think, about this liminal space between being a child and being an adult that feels to me like maybe the most important human developmental stage. And I feel like it's persistently like not taken seriously, I guess, is one way of putting it. And my own experience as a teenager were so, I mean, we call them the formative years, but there's also this way, I think, in which culturally we kind of deride teenagers, you know. So I'm really interested in that, like, importance and our cultural repugnance or you know, refusal to kind of honor teenagers with I think an acknowledgement of how interesting they are.
yeah, that's super interesting. How about for you?
I love that, first of all. It's true that I think adolescence is, it's funny because I think that, you know, there is a certain kind of cultural obsession with adolescence, but the noun, you know, this, like the stage, there are like 100, you know, TV shows about like high schoolers, for example, all like on average played by 36-year-olds. But I think that there's simultaneously, as you like I think correctly pointed out, like a tremendous disrespect, often, and like a unwillingness to engage with what it really means to be an adolescent, you know, like what it means to be young.
Yeah.
And I guess to answer your question, Ruth, I was interested in writing my novel like fundamentally in what it means to come of age. I think that coming of age is like this ancient and like cross-cultural script, right? You are, and the script more or less looks like you are a child, there is a disruption or rupture of some kind, or a certain kind of liminal space, which adolescence or youth is, and then you become an adult. You take your place in the order of things. And what I wanted to try to do with All This Could Be Different, you know, once I was like a third of the way through writing the book, and the book revealed itself to me in some ways, was, I think, look at two things, really. And the first one was about slowly maybe watching a young person, you know, the young person who in the reading I just gave, like, really has a specific theory about what it means to come of age, which is you have this window of latitude, and then you assume, you know, the responsibility of adulthood and sacrifice some part of yourself. And I think All This Could Be Different is interested in saying, well, what if that wasn't the exact script? What if, rather than sort of obediently taking our place in the order of things, we, as young people, what if young people push on the world itself, you know, to be more capacious and to accommodate them in some way? And I think that the second thing that I was interested in is this idea that you're always coming of age. We're all always becoming. And you know, that can happen at so many different ages. And I think the ending of the novel, like the final sort of coda or the final section of the novel, is an attempt to at least somewhat reckon with that.
Yeah. I'd love to follow up on that. You have a phrase early in the book that Sneha describes herself as 3 toddlers hiding in a suit. And then when she has lunch with a friend, she's like, now we're 6 toddlers hiding in suits. And I'd love to hear it. I thought that was so fascinating. Hear a little bit more about that.
I'm glad you like it. I mean, I experienced in my own life, like, the entry of, like my own entry into the working world as a tremendous amount of performance, you know? And I think that that line about toddlers in suits, you know, or like 3 toddlers in a trench coat, has to do with the fact that Sneha and her friends are performing what it means to be good, obedient workers as part of becoming good, obedient workers. And I think the last thing I'll say is All This Could Be Different, I think, is it's a coming of age novel for sure, but it's also one that does not focus on a teenager, right? It focuses on somebody who at the beginning of the book is 22, which I think underscores this idea that we're all always coming of age, or, you know, and for many people in my generation, I think the 20s are or can be the site of extended adolescence. But yeah, I think the frame of coming of age in All This Could Be Different is coming of age as a worker.
So interesting. Yeah, Susan, I love this moment when a teacher says to Sarah in trust exercises, young people like you experience pain more intensely than those of us just a bit older. I speak of emotional pain, it's greater in duration and strength, it's harder to bear. And I'm curious that with the teenagers in your novel, do you think that that is true, that they are experiencing things more intensely than older characters, older people?
I mean, I think that this is an idea that we share culturally, and I often wonder if there's a truth to it, that, you know, younger people experience emotion with greater intensity. You know, that we have an idea, a very romantic idea of first love, you know, this idea that first love has a certain quality that won't ever be repeated. And there's, you know, again, this kind of mingled mythologization of and admiration for these youthful ardors that we have. And then also I think this flip side of like a little bit of adult contempt for it. You know, this idea that, oh, you haven't yet learned to regulate those like intense gusts of emotion, which I think is also motivated by envy a little bit. So I'm interested in this idea. I don't know if it's a true one at all. I mean, I think that all of us at any age are capable of enormous disabling gusts of emotion. But I do think it's, again, part of this like cultural construction of what it means to come of age, which seems to involve a certain amount of relinquishment of emotional intensity, you know, that's sort of expected. And I just wanted to say I love Sarah, what you said about this continual coming of age. Because I think one of the things that has interested me also, like not just in this book, but in previous books of mine, is this feeling of the self continually shocked at its past iteration. You know, the teenagers in this book feel themselves to be very capable of decision-making. They feel that they have complete agency, especially in a situation where they might believe themselves to be consenting. But then their later selves look back at that previous version of the self in kind of shock and horror because they no longer feel that they could have consented. So this sense that you're always kind of becoming yourself in a new way, and those past selves come to seem discredited somehow, even though they're no less us. But that's been something that's interested me as well. The fact that like my 20-year-old self, when I look back at her from a later vantage, seems, as distant as like my 14-year-old self.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful point. It actually is a nice segue for structure, which is something I wanted to ask each of you about as you put the books together. And Susan, clearly this is your 5th book, so you've thought about structure over time, and I wondered how it's changed. And then for you, Sarah, how you thought about crafting this group of people and the shifting perspectives.
Do you want to speak to structure?
Sure. I think that what I knew going in was that I wanted the novel to hold a certain kind of movement from an I to a we. I wanted to start with somebody who believed herself to be atomized, alone, necessarily self-reliant, and also successful, right? Like, I think that is the starting point of my novel, and I wanted to chart a certain kind of like journey from it, like this individuated and atomized self to end up with this, group portrait of young people, these friends of wildly different background and personal history who could forge some kind of community and shared understanding, through love and struggle and really truly forming each other. So what ended up happening was I structured the novel ultimately in four parts, like called I, they, she, and we. And it sort of represents, I think, that arc and that movement.
Yeah, thank you.
I love that your book, I think, is like the triumph of connection and collectivity, and this book is like the triumph of disconnection and despairing fragmentation. It's definitely not the same arc. Structure is such an interesting thing for me to talk about. The structure of this book is a complete accident, and it came to be like as a series of sort of truly accidental interactions between me and a bunch of material that I wasn't intending to make into a book at all.
I'm obsessed.
But this is like one of those stories that I always hesitate to tell because I feel like it really undermines any idea that I might have any idea what I'm doing. So I'm always like a little reluctant. But structure is something that I struggle with every book. I have not gotten better at it, which I find quite remarkable. I'm working on my 6th book right now and just tore it completely apart and radically reordered it. And the radical reordering puts the events, wait for this, in chronological order. I mean, it only took me 5 years to think of that. So I don't know. It seems like the struggle is born anew every time. I just never seem to understand how to order things.
I love your answer for so many reasons, and also because I think it gestures towards something that I actually struggle to talk about or figure out like language for, which is how mysterious the process of making is, right? Like, I think that in my answer earlier, I was like, well, I wanted to do this, and so I did this. But it's also equally true to say that, like, the thing that was coming out of me, like the forming text, like, did something to me, right? It did what it wanted. That feels equally true to say.
Yeah, it always does what it wanted to do to some degree. I think that sense of,
I mean, it will sound very nice to call it a sense of discovery, and I think at best it feels like that when you're writing something and you have no idea what it is. The sense of discovery is like a nice way to put that, but it's also like that the despair of, I don't know if this will ever turn into anything that could be viewed as coherent.
Yeah.
But then sometimes it does.
I love the honesty of that answer about process and how it can be this journey and full of confusion. And I'd love to hear for each of you, what was the beginning spark for these books, and then what fueled you as you were tearing it apart, putting it back together, finding your way to the books that they ended up being?
Oh man. You know, I think the shortest answer I can give is the beginning spark of All This Could Be Different was 10 pages of what I thought would be a short story that would sort of be a disaffected, like, office novel with like a little bit of like, you know, like queer love story threaded throughout. And I looked at these pages and I was like, well, this is not a short story and I don't know what it is. And then simultaneously, I was really in the process of grieving and letting go of a novel I'd worked on for 7.5 years that I could not figure out how to make right, get right, like create an end product that even I wanted to read from beginning to end, which was, you know, bruising, to say the least. But then something happened for me where after I'd taken some space, frankly, away from writing, and reckoned, I think, with the possibility that writing might not be for me or might not be for me at that stage, at the stage of my life. This was all happening in 2020, which for many of us, I think, was a year of tumult and chaos and personal reckoning in a variety of ways. I found myself sometime, you know, in the maybe early summer of 2020, thinking about those first 10 pages and suddenly realizing that there was like a person attached to them in my mind. And she was a person I was very interested by, and I wanted to kind of like track her moving through time. And I did. You know, that's really the story of All This Could Be Different, like being, I think, troubled and fascinated and eventually very tender towards this person who, you know, came out of like a fictive voice on the page and a spare 10 pages scattered somewhere, you know, in some folder on my computer. And because 2020 was a year in my life where I lost most of my income, like I, you know, was doing all these things that reminded me of my early 20s, you know, like all of a sudden, again, I started to see like my bank account, you know, not doing so well. And I think it allowed me to, like revisit that time and all its like vulnerability and innocence, and ask myself, what do I think about that time? Like both in a generational sense, you know, and as well as a personal one.
This is really uncanny because our answers are so similar, which is very weird. Like, how have we never discussed this?
Okay.
So I was writing a book that, I love what you say about grieving a book that's not working, and I maybe will go and begin the grieving process for this book because I do think it is dead. And it's been, you know, it's been literally in a box for many, many years. So like maybe it's time to grieve and bury it. But I was working on a different book. It was not working out. And I was so frustrated that I decided that I was just gonna run away from this project and, you know, play hooky. And I was like, I just wanna do something fun, simple, straightforward. I'm just gonna write a short story. And it's going to have a very limited scope, which is the only way I can possibly make it work. And I have a great idea. And my great idea was two teenagers who are madly in love with each other and can't drive, and they live in a city with no mass transit. And I was like, how did they hook up? Simple. I was like, the conflict is obvious, and the solution also is obvious. And so I started writing about these teenagers. And then the other piece of influence that I'm kind of forgetting about is I was in a very pessimistic place and I was reading nothing but Muriel Spark. And her vibe of contempt for all living humans had just really gotten into me, and I was like, I'm gonna write a short, mean little story. And I started writing about these characters, and I'm just a weak person. I couldn't maintain the mean attitude toward them, and nor could I maintain the limited scope. And so it just ballooned, and 80 pages later, I was like, I give up. I can't write a short story to save my life. And so I just put it aside and went back to the other problematic project. And it was, sometime later that I had an experience similar to yours of, realizing that you really wanted to follow Sneha through time. Mine was slightly different, where I had an experience of suddenly thinking again about the kids as I thought of them. I just got curious about the kids again. I was like, what are they up to? Those horny kids. I loved them, and I felt this longing to return to their struggles.
That's very moving to me. And I don't know how we've never talked about this.
We spent so much of the pandemic on the phone, having these long, long conversations, but somehow never hit on this parallel.
Wow, I love that. I love that these books began with short stories that weren't really short stories, and that each of you were grieving a failed book, which I feel like we don't talk about enough as writers, and that there are these failed books and there is grief for them.
Yeah.
I'd love to know, you're in a room full of writers, to talk a little bit about your process and how do you like to write? When do you like to write? Are you everyday writers? Are you spurt writers?
Oh, I just talked. Come on.
Okay.
Say something about noise and silence.
I don't have a good answer for process. I very much feel like I am a journeyman writer, figuring it out myself. I suspect that process just probably needs to be different based on every project. I think that's the answer that I'm stumbling towards. I worked on my 7-year-long, novel Zero, dutifully, professionally. I sat down at my desk, at 9 a.m. And worked until 5, 6, whatever, during the time I was a student, and had the privilege of that freedom. When I was a working person and working on that book, I wrote it at night. But yeah, there was a diligence with that project. I was very committed to moving it forward, making pages. I did some research, and all this could be different. I wrote it in a completely different way. It's nuts, the comparison. I wrote it in bed during the pandemic, frequently in my pajamas, unshowered, looking insane. There were periods where I didn't, I wrote one page and then didn't engage with the book at all for 2 weeks, because things were happening in my life. I was also really involved with organizing in my neighborhood, and very frankly, that shit was more important. It was more important to me at that moment, I think, to be working with other ordinary people like myself, to try to do something to take care of each other, than it was to figure out what happened next in Sneha's life. And then there were periods of just maniacal scribbling and typing and ignoring my life. My real life felt less real to me. And then, there's, I think, 3-month stage of being gloriously selfish, and only writing, paying so little attention to anything else, that very candidly was enabled by, more than any one thing, the CARES Act. which passed in 2020 and allowed me to be on like a more generous unemployment policy to write. You know, that's really how I thought about it, and that's why the CARES Act is thanked in my acknowledgements. And since then I've been muddling my way through. Like sometimes I, write in like diligent and professional ways. Sometimes there have been periods in the last 2 years where I have moved away from writing, and I'm reading a lot. I'm reading the work of writers I admire to try to figure out, how do you do this thing? Because I really do think that there's something about being a writer where you are constantly, it's the opposite of the hero's journey in so many ways. You are going again and again from strength back to weakness. You're starting again, you have to figure out how do you do the new thing, because you often can't use the logic and the practices of the old.
Yeah, that's such a great answer. I love that you mentioned the CARES Act, because as you were describing these two versions of process, whatever that is, I was reflecting on the fact that whenever I read in literary biography or something to that effect about this beautiful process, it's like Leonard in Virginia, and like they would go to Monk's house and they would do this and they would do that, and she would have her page. I'm always sort of filled with rage, and I think, and I no one loves them more than me, but I do think that we have ideas as writers about process and about the right way to do it that I think, at least for me, many of them descend from the lives of writers who enjoyed, if I can just say, lives in which they did not have to work for a wage. And it's taken a long time in my life for me to recognize that a lot of the writers that I admire and emulate and often am made to feel inadequate by were writers who had enormous personal wealth and were able to order their time in ways that will just never be an option for me. And so, at this kind of late stage of life, I've recognized like, oh, that just isn't gonna work for those of us who have to, for example, work for a living and support our children, or, have obligations that take us away from the glorious desk, and as you were talking as well, I was thinking about how with my own work, every single project has been like this kind of crazy Venn diagram of like, here's what the material was like, uniquely weird. Here's what my life was like at that moment, always uniquely weird. Like maybe there are toddlers running around, or maybe one of my parents is extremely ill, or et cetera, et cetera. And then over here is like this sort of toolbox of like ways of trying to write, and one thing is working. And so, it's like what you described. It's like the game of Clue. It's like all this could be different in bed with pajamas very sporadically. like that's how that happened. And with my own books, I think A Person of Interest in my neighbor's apartment upstairs, while I could literally hear my toddler screaming through the air shaft for me, and was like shutting the window 3 to 4 hours a day when there wasn't like a repairman coming over. Like that was that process. It's always different.
I love both of your generosity in those answers and your candor. You said something, Susan, that really interested me, which was during the pandemic that you two spoke on the phone for hours and hours. And I'd love for you to tell us about how did that come to be, and what were you talking about for hours?
How did this amazingly come to be? I'll tell the story from my end, which is that we were paired in a mentorship program. And were we paired before the pandemic began? And then the pandemic suddenly blew up, and our whole mentor-mentee thing ended up being on the phone? Is that what happened?
I think more or less, yeah. So the Asian American Writers Workshop, which is an amazing institution, I think really does try to, connect young Asian American writers with people who, like writers who are further along in their careers, able to provide some kind of guidance, support, encouragement. And Susan and I were paired together, and it's funny because one of the things I said to Susan when and it's true that I think our meeting and connection at all was meaningfully delayed by the pandemic. I think that, like, in my memory anyway, we started talking in like 2021 or something, like maybe after I had written All This Could Be Different. But one of the things that I told Susan was that I was deeply skeptical of mentorship as a concept, and also made a little uncomfortable by it. And I think I said something, I probably sounded like a clown, but I think I was just like, I am maybe just interested in being friends, or approximating that. And you were so generous.
I was so relieved, actually. Okay. Well, because my memory of this, I'm very skeptical of mentoring, mainly because it's a very overwhelming thing to be approached to serve as a mentor. I was like, I'm still looking for a mentor myself, so I don't really know what. There's this expectation, and I remember the first time we talked. First of all, we just talked for like. I feel like we were on the phone, and I have such vivid, lovely memories of our conversations because I was always indoors, and it was always I feel like it was always cold outside, and we would be on the phone for like 90 minutes at a time, and I have no idea. But you did say something to the effect of like, could we just talk about stuff? And I was like, oh yes, please. Like, let's just talk about stuff, and we did. We just talked about so many things.
Yeah, I think like our lives, the projects we were working on, and yeah, I mean, I sort of distinctly remembered when I first got an email being like, you've been paired with Susan Choi, and I was like, yes! You know, I was just like, all right. And it was before I'd written All This Could Be Different, and then time went by, life happened, the world exploded, and I, wrote this manuscript in a way that it really felt like I was not in control of anything, like everything just like happened at me. And then I remember thinking like, oh my God, like I don't know what to talk to Susan about, and I've like written this book, and I just remember feeling really like a little bit unmoored before the conversation. And in practice, it was just so helpful to hear about your life and about your writing, and I think so much of being a young person in any context, right? And I think for me, this has to do with this question you gestured at earlier, which is like, are young people more emotional than their older selves? And I would argue like sort of mostly no, but I think that there's something very painful about having less experience and like a sort of shorter temporal horizon to evaluate your own life, to like not have certain kinds of experience where you can contextualize, any like a given moment, a given crisis, and be like, well, I lived that, and that was fine, and so I have some sense of how I might approach this. And I think the overwhelming feeling of being young is everything is so big, and I don't have a referent.
Right.
I don't have enough perspective on it.
Right, yeah, and by the same token, I think I gained a lot of perspective. I think it's interesting to acquire experience whether you're aware of it or not. And I think talking to Sarah, a lot of the time I was like being made aware in conversation of the fact that I had been through something like that, or this thing had taken place, or I had one kind of struggle and then a different kind of struggle, and it was actually really useful to me to regain that perspective on my own life and go like, oh, some stuff has happened to me, and I've actually gained some like useful information from it.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing the process and your conversations with all of us. It reminds me of a question that I had for you both, which is about how you find nourishment for your creative process for yourselves as writers. And I think especially as we're gathered as writers, it's something that we all think about a lot. So I'm curious what sources of nourishment you find for your practice.
I think that there are like two interlocking answers. And I think one, speaking of like experience that teaches you things, like sometimes painfully, I think something that I have learned is that like I need to, like that life comes first, maybe for me before writing. And I think, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, I don't know that I would have framed it quite that way. I would have said, I was like a workaholic young person in a variety of ways, including writing. I was like deeply self-serious about this stuff. And I paid very little attention to myself and what I needed and to care for myself and let other people care for me, which is its own art for many of us. And so I think the thing that I need in my writing actually is for my life to at least some of the time be going okay, right? And so I think I've done a much better job in recent years of caring for myself, letting people care for me, eating well, sleeping well, paying attention to my health, maybe not destroying my lower back from working from bed, things like that. But the other answer, which is equally true, is that whenever I feel truly unnourished, I read. I try to read something that I think will feed me. And, maybe 2 weeks ago, I felt in that place. And I want to, if you will, very quickly read 2 lines from the thing that helped me, which is Trust Exercise by Susan Choi.
Oh, come on. I was like, what is she going to read?
Good book, recommend. It's truly only 2 lines. He looks, and to be clear, I think that what I'm about to read, it says something to me about what coming of age means, and it also made something click for me in my own writing. He looked alien to her, unhandsome, though this quibble peeped faintly at her from beneath the hard weight of her lust. The lust in its turn was eclipsed by another and unprecedented emotion, an onrush of sad tenderness, as if the man he would be, full of unguessed at darkness and weakness, had, for a brief instant, shone through the boy. And I thought, that's so beautiful. Susan's fantastic prose and sentences, but I also, sorry, I'm just pretending that you're not here, in order to give truly a truthful answer, right? And I think that for me, the value of coming of age as a narrative, as a container for any of us to pass through, for any of us to hold in our own writing or our reading, is the slippage of time that these 2 lines gesture towards. We're never, in my opinion, only our present selves, our soft, crushed flower, young selves, full of innocence and inexperience and pain and beauty, live within us always. And it's that movement, that slippage of time back and forth that I think is useful and productive and helps almost all of us make meaning at all. So that's my answer.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you.
I have no such answer of such beauty. Thank you. That was really an amazing experience to hear those lines read by you. So my answer is much simpler, which is that I read. But I was actually thinking as you asked that I think, speaking of the different selves, I've become a much more open and random person, I guess, in the way I move through the world, and it's been really great. I realized that a lot of those past selves of mine were very concerned about the right way to do things. What should I be reading right now? What should I be consuming? What kind of thinker should I be? I think I've always been kind of a good student my whole life in a way that's both helpful and a little hampering. Always thinking oh, what should I be studying? And I don't know, more recently in my life, I've become much more able to kind of wander the weird interior hallways of my thoughts and just end up reading things that I don't know why I'm reading them, but on some level I have this weird faith that if I want to read this, it'll lead somewhere. And so kind of indulging that total randomness.
I love that.
I just feel like reading the Iliad now, and I'm just going to read the Iliad for a while, and then I stopped feeling that way and I hadn't finished, which is always the good student in me is like, no, you must finish. And I was like, I'm gonna wander off away from the Iliad now and do some other thing. And it's a funny thing to admit because I do think that like, it shouldn't seem like such a big lesson to learn to kind of embrace that inner randomness. But it has taken a long time for me. And I think really Trust Exercise is a book that came out of a certain embrace of that randomness. Like I kind of had gotten over my anger at myself for not finishing that other book, for not like proceeding in an orderly, organized fashion through writing career world, and was able to kind of keep randomly picking up this thing and sticking more words to it and then wandering off again. And at some point there was a thing. Yeah.
That's so comforting to hear.
Yeah, being more disorganized. That's
Well, I can do with that.
I find that deeply comforting as well.
or
Thank
maybe
you.
more forgiving of one's own disorganization.
Yeah.
I've always been disorganized.
Absolutely. Me too. One of the things that I think is so beautiful about both of your books is that they really wrestle with sexual violence against women as kind of a root undercurrent. And I think you both handle it so skillfully and very differently. And I'm curious how you thought about that as you were approaching the projects. And was that a conscious choice, or did it just come to you as you spent time with these characters?
Thank you for that question. I think this is another sort of moment where I am unsure whether to say the truth that positions me as someone in control, like the architect of the work, or the person flopping around in the waves of the work. And the answer is both are true. I think that there's a degree to which, yeah, it just sort of happened. Like, I think it felt part of like when I paid attention to Sneha, my protagonist's voice, it was clear that there was like a very meaningful wound that was like present like it was in the past, but also exerting, its many and long arms into her life and into like her personhood. And because I felt that in the voice, like it just sort of happened, it unspooled on the page. But I also think that in some ways I was dealing with like a craft meets political problem. And that craft meets political problem is, all this could be different is like among other, unwieldy labels, I think it is an immigration novel of a kind, and it is the story of this young Indian woman who has to, I think, reckon with what it means to find home, which I think can mean many different things, right? But it's also a geographic question. And Sneha is from two very different worlds. And I think that one question I had, that was coming at me from the text is, why is she trying to stay in America? Like, what is informing this sort of desire to stay in the US when it's not where her family is? And that felt complicated in part because, I wanted to avoid writing a certain kind of platitude-y novel about had this kind of unconscious American exceptionalism within its logic. And then I thought, because something happened, there's a certain kind of wound, a certain kind of rupture, a certain kind, all this could be different, I think is described as a novel about community, how beautiful, like butterflies and flowers, but it's also equally a story about failed community and an attempt to reconcile with that failure and the tremendous weight of that in one person's life.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I appreciate this question too, and it's one that I actually don't think I've ever been asked about the book, so thank you. Yeah. It's so interesting to think back, and there's a similar aspect to the evolution of that aspect of the book in that, I've already told about how this was supposed to be a very simple short story about the two teens in love /lust. But I'd also already mentioned that, I wrote 80 pages, and obviously that wasn't a short story. One of the things that happened that caused the pages to keep coming and the premise to kind of keep spooling outward instead of coming inward like a short story should, was that this teacher walked into the room, because I was like, oh, my two teenagers, they're in love/lust, they're teenagers, they're at school. The logic of school is that there's a teacher there. The logic of that is that they're in a classroom together with the teacher. Let's write some scenes, students and teacher. And very, very quickly, those scenes took on this tone of, I don't want to say menace is too strong a word, but a shadow fell across the page in a way where I sort of knew almost as soon as I started writing about this teacher who's enormously charismatic, that he held a power over these students that was going to be wielded in a way that was wrong. I just sort of knew, and it wasn't part of the plan, but as soon as that knowledge arrived, the story starts taking on its own logic, right? And at that point, as you said about sort of thinking like, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, what is it about home that has driven Sneha away from home? Like, you learn this thing about your characters, and then you're like, what are the events that created these conditions? It's so those strange surprises of writing where you're like, my characters are living these certain conditions that I hadn't planned on. Why? And this question of the teacher and the teacher's role in their lives immediately was kind of the answer.
Oh, I love knowing that about both of your books. Thank you for that. I'm curious, what was one of the first books that you fell in love with? And then are there books that you've read recently that everyone in this room should go and pick up and read?
I mean, I really am loving the Iliad. The fact that I've put it down for a bit should not. You guys, it's really good. If anyone hasn't heard of it. No, you go first.
I would say a fantastic and contemporary coming-of-age novel is, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, Idlewild by James Frankie Thomas, which is like operatic and just like such a delight. I recommend to nearly everybody. And it's about like these two teenagers in a private Quaker school in Manhattan, like in the 9/11 era, and it's crazy good. I think that there are books that were so formative to me that they are part of the reason why I felt as a young person, as a teenager, that I had to write. I didn't think about it as becoming a writer. I thought I want to write. And I think that The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison was more than any book, that book for me. And I think that the book that influenced All This Could Be Different the most, or influence is not even the right word, it felt like it handed me a key to like unlock a door I couldn't go through at first, was Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid, which I also recommend to all.
I could mention so many books, and I've already mentioned the Iliad, so I'm thinking back to books that really kind of changed me when in that pure state of just being a reader, before it ever occurred to me to write, and before I ever started thinking like as a writer, what should I read? And that sort of hyper self-conscious, pretentious thinking took hold of me really early in life. Like I was definitely that teenager, like, smoking too much and showing up at the bookstore in like a black t-shirt and, reading Henry Miller because I was under the impression that was the sort of, sexually edgy stuff I should be reading. And but long before that, when I was a little kid, I read so many books that were so enormous for me. And one was this series of books called The Borrowers by Mary Norton. I don't know if anybody knows The Borrowers, but I have such a deep love of those books. They were so just joyful to me, and it makes me happy even just to think about them. The borrowers are little tiny people who have to borrow everyday objects from normal humans in order to create their sort of below the floorboards life. And I just loved reading stuff like that when I was young and have never kind of gotten over that, like that pure state of just entering into another world that reading can bring us. And you know, when I think about the DNA of this book, which is a long way from the borrowers, which I tried to plagiarize a lot when I was a kid. I wrote a series called The Pinheads, and it was unique because they were even smaller than the borrowers. They were about like 1/3 the height. But the DNA of this book is incredibly indebted to Jennifer Egan, who I think also goes back to your question about like nourishing one's own work. It's through admiring the work of the other writers that I'm incredibly lucky to live at the same time as, including you. And, you know, watching their careers unfold and waiting to see what they'll do next. And I remember when Jennifer Egan published The Keep, and I, you know, grabbed it and devoured it, and I was so blown away by what she was doing. And I don't think it's one of her best-known novels, actually, and so that's, I would love to repair that. Go out and read it. But she did something so exciting in that book that really jolted me, and I didn't consciously remember it when I came to, you know, accidentally kind of write trust exercise, but it was definitely a deep part of how this book ended up being the oddball that it is.
Oh my gosh, I love those answers. Thank you for talking about so many books you love. And I think we have time for about one more question. And so the question that I most wanted to ask you both is that one thing I love about your books is that you wrestle with deeply political things, but you do it in a way that it doesn't tip over the novels. And I think that is such a hard thing to do. And I just would love to hear you talk about how you thought about that as you were crafting these.
I'll give an uncharacteristically short for me answer, and say, and it's short in part because it's fine if you don't have time for it, but I would love to ask Susan one question from a completely selfish place.
Totally.
But yeah, I thought about it, like, I think the way politics happens in this book is very informed by the time I wrote it, is 2020. I felt like politics was everything and all around us, and determined everything, and I was just interested by how do you do this in a way that doesn't alienate a reader, because I personally have a small attention span, I'm impatient, you know, and I am particularly impatient when anyone, like, you know, who I'm doing the great favor of reading, is condescending to me or didactic. And so I thought, well, politics is life and death, right? In this, like, that's what I really felt at the time. I'm a little bit more moderate in my feeling now. And I thought, well, what if I let, rather than like any character be right or do the right thing or say the eloquent and appropriately like intellectual thing at some cocktail party, what if I just put a bunch of people together and let them struggle against each other and collide with each other and like, you know, like all be a little bit right and all be a little bit wrong, and let that inform how politics in the novel functions, like through action, collision, and dialogue.
That's such a great answer. I think my answer is, first of all, going to be indebted to what Sarah said, because I too think that politics is everything and everywhere and affects all of our lives, even if we don't pay attention, especially if we don't pay attention, even if we wish it wasn't the case. And, you know, a lot of my thinking about how to write about politics comes from my thinking about the political novel and what this is. And I've always been very irritated by that term, the political novel, because it seems to suggest that, you know, politics are kind of a special topic that you can engage with or not. And so, you know, this novel might engage with them, but, you know, I feel that like all of life is deeply political and affected by politics, and how can you write a novel that isn't also deeply affected and influenced by politics? And for that reason, I feel like the novel is political, and the political novel is this sort of compartmentalizing of politics that feels quite false to me, if if that makes sense. And so it's this sort of contradictory thing where I'm always trying to figure out how to just reflect kind of the bedrock political conditions of my characters in the story without making it a political novel, which suggests that it could have been not a political novel. I don't know if that makes sense, but like the thing that I'm working on now is influenced in large part by this act of kind of state-sponsored violence that affects the family. And I'm really like turning myself inside out, trying to figure out how to write about their lives in such a way that it's not about this thing that happens to them, but they are a family, and this thing is one of the many things that has happened, to kind of avoid this sense of the exceptional nature of this violence that's visited upon them. That was a very abstruse answer.
I loved it. Yeah, yeah.
Still working on that one.
Yeah. Did you want to ask your
Yes.
question?
Oh boy.
Okay, pass on this if you're like, this is a ridiculous question, Sarah, like, why are you asking me this? But I'm truly so interested to know what you think about what does it mean to you to grow up?
To grow up.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's such an amazing question, actually. I think about this a lot currently because I am having like a lot of the layered self phenomenon that you so beautifully articulated, where I feel I'm in my 50s now, and so part of my thinking about growing up in the layered selves is that I can't believe it. And why? Like, what is my problem? Why am I so amazed to be in my 50s? Like, why am I so sort of still viewing the 50s like from the standpoint of the 20s, where I'm like, what? She's in her 50s? Oh my God. And then, within also, that's so ageist. Susan, what's your problem? Being in your 50s, it's awesome. No, it's not. It's so old. No, it's not. It's so young. So it's like there's a lot of internal insanity. And I think maybe what I think about growing up is that it is letting go of the idea that you ever do, I think, because I don't think it happens. I think we keep being another self, and then all the previous selves are still there. So the cacophony is like crazy at times. But yeah, I think in my 20s I thought I had grown up, and now I understand that, like, no.
Thank you. Like, truly, thank you.
Thank you for asking. It wasn't such a crazy question.
Oh my gosh, and thank you both for a beautiful conversation and for your beautiful books. This has been a gift. Yeah, please join me in thanking our wonderful authors. And please join us out front to get your book signed.